So, again, thank you for being here, and Susthama.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. So today I'd like to talk about refuge from the psychological perspective and also a Pure Land one. But before I begin, I think there's an echo. If everyone can mute, then that might be better. Okay, I think that's better. Thank you. I'd like to just sketch out a little bit of the historical and chronological development of the practice of taking refuge. And I'd like to introduce two lay disciples. They were the first lay disciples, Trapuza and Balika. So after the Buddha attained enlightenment, he then has to do something, right? So what is known is that the first person he came across was another ascetic, and at that time the Buddha is known as the ascetic Gautama, just another ascetic who's striving to attain enlightenment. So no one yet knows, no human knows that he's a Buddha. So the first ascetic monk that he comes across doesn't really, sort of give him much time. The Buddha tells him about his discovery of the Dharma, and the other monk is known to have said something like, well, that's very nice, and I'll see you later. And then the next two people to come across the ascetic are two merchants who are just traveling through the area, probably on business, and they don't know who he is either, but they stop, they talk to him, they like what he has to say, and they ask him what they could do. And so the Buddha says, well, take refuge. And at that time, there's no Sangha. There's just the Dharma. So he instructs Trapuza and Balika to take refuge in the Dharma. And they say yes, and they don't change their lives. They just want to take what they've learned home with them. And so they ask the ascetic, well, could we have something of yours to remind us of you and this teaching? And so the Buddha gives them 8 strands of hair, or 8 clumps of hair. So at this time too, there's a sense that, okay, the Buddha isn't completely shaven yet. He still has hair, and he gives them something to remember him and the teachings by, and he instructs them to build a stupa and to put the hair in. So he shows them how to, by folding his robe in squares, and he then takes the bowl and overturns it. So this sort of like marks out the beginning of what lay disciples do. They build stupas. They put something in the stupa, a relic of the Buddha, to remind them. They have a place to go to worship, so that they can actually focus their minds on remembering the Buddha's teachings, remembering the Dharma, remembering the Buddha. And they don't convert, they don't leave their household lives to become monastics. So the other thing that Trapuza and Balika do is they offer the Buddha his first meal after enlightenment. So again, this sets up the practice of the lay community providing food for the monastic community. And so with that comes the sense of refuge as an object, so that they have something to focus their minds on. And then, and then after the Buddha meets the first 2 lay disciples, he then goes and finds the other ascetics. And again, the ascetics, like what this ascetic Gautama says. And so in the early Pali Canon, which is the the texts that are written about the stories of the Buddha's life, they talk about the Buddha not as the Buddha or the Blessed One in the early sutta. They talk about the ascetic Gautama or Master Gautama. So with the early bhikkhus that meet the ascetic, they take refuge in Master Gautama, in the Dharma, and in the community of monks. So this then shifts as time goes on to taking refuge in the Buddha once the Buddha has established himself as an enlightened and awakened person. The community of monks changes to the Sangha as the community changes from not just a monastic community, but to lay communities. And so now what we have is taking refuge in 3 gems, the Buddha, the Sangha, and the Dharma. And then in our Pure Land tradition, we've added on 2 more gems, which include Amida Buddha and the Pure Land. So you can see that from the very beginning, it went from refuge in 1 gem to 2 to 3. And now for us, we've added 2 more to make it 5. And so I'd like to look at the psychological effect it has on us, and to look at how our experiences lead us to feeling a certain way, but also that our feelings help us to look at the world in a particular way. So it's like chicken and egg. It's hard to know which comes first. Do the feelings come first, and then we look out in the world to justify our feelings or explain the feelings that have come up in us? Or is it the experience that we have first that then triggers a feeling that is connected and associated to the experience that we've had? So in Buddhism, we have the teaching of one thing leading to another. So when we look at something like the Four Noble Truths, the first 2, you could say, there's 2 different ways of interpreting and understanding. You could say that dukkha is first, suffering, and then the second truth is samudaya, which is from dukkha, something rises up in us, a reaction, a feeling. Or the more common and traditional interpretation is that, yes, there's dukkha, but the reason that there's dukkha is because of trishna, or craving, the feeling that we want to grasp something. And when we don't get it, we experience suffering. So both work, because often the experience and feelings happen almost simultaneously in a split second. It's difficult to know which comes first. But whether it's our feelings that arise first and then we look out, or whether something's happened that triggers a feeling, what it says is that they're connected. So how we feel is very much dependent on how we perceive the world around us. And so an example is, if we're sitting here and someone comes in with, say, something like cake or alcohol or cigarettes, something that we can smell, something that we can see, depending on our relationship to these things, will generate a different feeling in each of us. If we love cake and we don't have an issue with our weight, then we might think, yay, yum, let me eat. If we're on a diet, for example, and we don't want to be tempted, we might start to feel stressed. So, and then vice versa. If nothing is happening and we're sitting and we're just meditating, but all of a sudden we have a feeling of anxiety or stress or anger or frustration, there's nothing that changed in our environment around us and the external conditions to lead to those feelings. So the feelings have come from somewhere, and often, not just when we're sitting in meditation, but often we look to understand, why is that feeling there? Was it because of this? Was it because of that? So whether it's something that's come into the room that's created the feelings, or whether there are feelings, we're always trying to connect it together to help explain why they're there. And depending on our feelings will determine how we look at the world. How we look at the world will also reinforce some of the feelings that are there. So later on, we'll have more chance to discuss this, so that you get a chance to understand it a little bit clearer if it's a little bit fuzzy at the moment. But to help us understand, I thought I'd just sort of give a very simplistic view of the mental landscape, just to help make it a little bit clear. There's so many different metaphors that we can use to work with the mind. And so this is just one of them. So you could say that the mental landscape is in nature. On one side, there's the ocean, and the ocean represents all the things that we don't know. So we get a sense that there's stuff going on. It's big, it's vast, it's deep. And until things start to ripple at the surface, then we get a sense of what it might be. But until it comes to the surface, it's very difficult to know. So there's quite a huge part of us that we don't know. And then on the other side, you could say that there's a forest, and the forest represents all the things that we do know, all the things that we're working with, that our day is filled up with, that we see, and we could say that we know certain things. And then in between is a beach area, and that's where the two meet. There's some things that we don't know and some things that we do know. And in this part of the beach, when we start to experience dukkha, so dukkha includes all the physical, existential elements of life, such as birth, aging, sickness, death, and also the psychological aspects of not getting what we want or getting what we don't want, all the pain, the feelings of frustration, sadness. They're all part of being human. So in our mental landscape, we have on the beach quicksand. So the quicksand represents all the dukkha. And you could say that we don't know when we're going to step into it, but when we do, we have that sensation of sinking, just like you would if you stepped into quicksand. Once we're in there, there's a feeling of panic, of wanting to get out of there. So this is what dukkha or suffering would feel like. It's not pleasant. It's not comfortable. It takes over. And you could even say that each grain of sand in that quicksand represents a different aspect of dukkha, worry, fear, to all the existential stuff. So when we're in the state of, say, panic or fear, you could say that that isn't us, that's dukkha, or that is quicksand. And what to do when we're in quicksand? It's very difficult to know when we're panicking what it is that can help us get out of there. And this is where you could say, most of us, we take refuge in so many ways, so many different things, not sacred things though. So any object that we trust, any object that we use. So you could say in modern society, secular society, people take refuge in shopping or in banking institutions, in things that are impermanent, temporary. And it brings a certain amount of comfort at the time when it's working for us. But when it doesn't work for us, then we're back in the quicksand. So the importance of refuge in objects that are more permanent, more satisfying, everlasting, that we can trust and rely on to always be there to help us when we're in the quicksand, is important for our psychological and spiritual and physical well-being. So with the sense of being in the quicksand, the 5 refuges from a Pure Land perspective helps us actually stay with being in the quicksand and still feeling okay. So I'm going to explain sort of a process that that might be helpful to understand how that works. So we understand, I think everyone knows about the 3 jewels that Buddhists take refuge in. And this is across the board. So what all Buddhists have in common, like Will said, is that Buddhists take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. For Pure Land Buddhists, we start from a position of feeling that we could never be Buddha. We could never attain anything by ourselves. So we rely on a Buddha called Amida Buddha to save us, to help us transform our lives. There's still things that we need to do, but the emphasis isn't on ourselves. It's on looking at the support all around us, at the conditions around us, including other people, the Buddha's teachings, the sun, nature, all of that. So in the mental landscape, you could almost imagine that Amida would be represented by the sun. And so the sense of being in quicksand and the way to get out of it from, say, a Pure Land perspective would be to accept that we're in the quicksand, and that if we were to try to get out of the quicksand ourselves, we would probably make things worse and sink into the quicksand even more. And that if we could actually think about an object of refuge that is always there for us, then we would have a better chance of getting out of the quicksand. And so once in the quicksand, Amida is represented by the sun, and the sun is always there somewhere in the sky. Maybe we can't see it, maybe it's a cloudy day, maybe it's nighttime, but we can always trust that at some point the sun will be in the sky above us, and we might be able to catch a glimpse of it to reassure us that it's still there. Otherwise, we live with a certain amount of faith that it is there and it'll always shine. And if it's nighttime and there's a moon, then we can be reassured by seeing the moon, because otherwise, if the sun weren't there, we wouldn't see the moon reflected in the sky. And Amida Buddha as a refuge represents the radical acceptance of us as humans who suffer, who end up most times walking unwittingly, not knowing that we're doing it, into the quicksand and sinking and needing help. And so by remembering that all we need to do is look up at the sky, remember and have faith that the sun is still shining down on us. And because we're in the quicksand, is there to help us. If we weren't in the quicksand, we wouldn't need the sun. We wouldn't need Amida's help. We would be able to do things on our own. So Amida is there for those who are in the quicksand and who need help to get out of the quicksand. And then once we feel that sense of, okay, we might not be able to accept the suffering that we're in, but Amida can. And if Amida can accept it, then maybe we would stand a better chance of accepting it. Then we can then think about the Buddha. And the Buddha then comes as a practical and skillful means. What can we do to actually help ourselves out of the quicksand? Who and how would the Buddha guide us out? And one of the things about quicksand is if we spread our arms out wide and legs out and stay still, then there's more chance of us not sinking, but just staying still, almost floating. At that point, if we reached out to the side and trusted that the Buddha was there, giving us compassion and wisdom, then we'd be able to reach over onto the beach that's firm, that's solid, and make our way out. And then moving to the Dharma as refuge. The Dharma is the spiritual perspective, the wisdom, the compassion, the wisdom of knowing that we can't get rid of the quicksand. We can't get rid of the dukkha. We have to learn to live with it. And in accepting that this is how it is, we learn how to apply compassion to our own lives and to others. So if we can feel what it's like to be in our own quicksand, then we can imagine what it's like for someone else. If we can imagine what it's like for someone else, then, and we can be with them in their quicksand, that's compassion. So, and then moving on to the Sangha as refuge. The Sangha connects us to other people who also struggle with their own quicksand. So the sense that we're not alone. If we were to include everyone that we know in our Sangha, or past Buddhist teachers and friends, then if we could understand their lives and what they've been through, we would see that they too have experienced lots of suffering. And we could then almost imagine that all of us are in quicksand together. We're not alone. And we can take comfort that if we can accept that this is part of life, then we could probably figure out a way for all of us to get out or to live with it better. So it builds up this friendly empathy towards the human condition. And then the next object is the Pure Land. So Pure Land as refuge is a little bit more difficult to talk about. And I won't go into what a Pure Land is, but as an object and the psychological effect on us, it's like a magnetic field where if you have a lodestone, for example, that is very magnetic and strong, when you go into that magnetic field as just an iron, dull, non-magnetic rock, on a very subtle level, things start to change and one becomes aligned with the magnetic field. So the effect of being in the presence of other people who have a connection and relationship to things like radical acceptance of the human condition, who practice skillful means and who have a spiritual perspective and who are friendly and who practice empathy to oneself and to others, we can then copy and change and align with those values. And so it's not so much creating a Pure Land, more than really feeling what it's like to align with a certain set of values. So I thought I'd just sort of end with the Kuti Sutta, which is a lovely sutta that's found in the Khuddaka Nikaya, which is a collection of short texts. And this is Udana 5.3. And it's about a leper called Supabuddha. And it was, I found out about the sutta by a friend, another Buddhist teacher in the Theravadan tradition. And that this is the closest story probably to what it's like to feel like a bamboo in the Pure Land tradition. So bamboo is a foolish being of wayward passion, or just someone who's unable to attain enlightenment by one's own power. Because the story in this sutta is about a leper, and this leper is ostracized, is cast out, is always searching for a group that is gathering so that they can go and just get whatever food is available from that group, always on the edge. And on this one occasion, he happens to be where the Buddha is staying, and he sees a large gathering, but he doesn't know that the Buddha is there. So he goes over thinking, well, there's a large group, which means there'll be food. And if I just go, I can scavenge, get some food. When he gets there, there's no food. And he then finds out that it's a gathering of bhikkhus, and the Buddha is there giving a talk. So he thinks, okay, I'll just sit and listen, because he's heard about the Buddha and he wants to learn more. So he sits at the very edge, and then the Buddha is in contemplation and aware of the group that's gathered, and thinks to himself, who here would be able to understand what I have to teach? And he looks out at the audience and he sees the leper. And he thinks, Supabuddha, the leper, will understand. And so he then makes a connection to the leper and makes the leper feel very, very important, and lets the leper know that his mind is so clear that he's able to understand what the Buddha has to teach. Now, everyone else in the audience is definitely more refined, more practiced, more intellectual than the leper. So the leper is crying because he feels that the Buddha has seen something in him that no one else has seen. And the Buddha is able to connect to him, to give him the love that then leads the leper to attaining enlightenment. And he then becomes a Buddhist monk and joins the community. So it's a very similar feeling of what it's like to have nothing, and to feel that having nothing is it isn't an obstacle to gaining enlightenment. That this is the acceptance that Amida Buddha gives to us, in the same way that the Buddha gave the acceptance to the leper. And I thought that was just a lovely sort of illustration of that relationship that can be so transformative in one's life. So I'll end there so that we can open it up for discussion now.